Good evening. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to deliver this lecture. My name is Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmad. I am a principal research scientist at Kensai, a startup based in Seattle, and also an affiliate assistant professor at University of Washington, Tacoma. Today, I will be talking about digital afterlife. That is, how can we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to create simulations of the deceased? Simulations of people, our loved ones who may have passed away, our families, our friends, people who we hold near and dear. October 29th, 2013. That's the day that the world as I know it ended. And yet, for billions of people in the world, it was just another day. People went about their business as they had the day before. It was the day that the world ended for me because it was the day that my father, Mushtaq Ahmad Mirza, he passed away. I can still vividly recall when my brother called me on around October 24th to tell me that the doctor had informed him that our father is not going to survive for long. The world stood still. I have lived through the moment many times. There was a feeling of not just grief, but also helplessness. There was nothing that I could do to make the reality untrue. The world just stood still. And yet, that was also the genesis of an idea. Most art and science is personal. One of the things that came to my mind was I won't be able to interact with my father. But one day, if I have children, they won't also have the opportunity to interact with my father, to know what wonderful person he was. All of my grandparents passed away before I was 5. I have almost no memories of my grandparents, and certainly my paternal grandparents, both of whom had passed away more than 10 years before I was born. My thought was actually vindicated by what my nephew said a few days after my father passed away. I had a niece, she was just a few months old, and my nephew, Abdul Wasi, he said, I feel sorry for her that she will never get a chance to interact with her grandfather. She will not know what kind of person he was. So, the story that I'm going to tell is a very personal story. It may sound like a story filled with the latest technologies in machine learning and artificial intelligence and natural language processing. But at the end of the day, it's a very personal story. A story of a son trying to reconcile with loss, with suffering, with grief, trying to long for that one last chance. The question that I had for myself was perhaps technology can provide one such have a chance. That day, the question that I asked myself was, well, if I had kids one day, then most certainly my father cannot interact with him, but maybe they can interact with him. Maybe they can interact with a simulation of my father. So perhaps the dear departed cannot come back, but maybe, just maybe, we can converse. So here's an outline of what I will be talking about for the rest of the talk. A brief summary of our history as a human race, of commemorating the dead. And what is a simulation? What does it mean to simulate the deceased? And in my context, what does this project mean for me? Some of the ethical, legal, and personal questions that have arisen from this project. And what are the implications for the future? So I'll start with the question, what is death? 30 years ago, we had a much clearer idea of what constitutes death with respect to the boundary between life and death. One could define it in terms of cardiac arrest or brain death. And while this definition is still approximately correct, there have been some recent cases where partial reversal in both these cases has been demonstrated. So because of that, there's variability of definitions of death in medical practice. For the purpose of this talk, for this discussion, we won't go into the medical definitions. For us, death, or the notion of death that we are interested in, is the experience of death. That is, how do people experience the departed, the deceased? Intentional burial is often considered as a proxy for belief in afterlife in the archaeological record. The oldest known intentional burial is in Kafze cave in the Middle East, which actually dates to 100,000 years. And that's often considered to be the beginning of not necessarily abstract thought, but abstract thought and beliefs about the afterlife. And there are thinkers who say that all science, art, and religion is an attempt by humankind to confront the reality of death. In the past, or one could even say throughout most of human history, we have commemorated the deceased, the past, in terms of and by telling stories and narratives about them. For very few people, a very small subset of humanity, they try to commemorate themselves and their loved ones in the style of grand monuments. For example, I was in Egypt just last week, and so the pyramids of Giza, they were one of the greatest monuments of humankind. They were constructed to commemorate the Egyptian pharaohs, their deaths, to be remembered after they have passed away. And yet, looking at these monuments, these to human ingenuity, I could not help think that to be remembered is not just to be remembered in grand narratives of glory, but in the hearts of one's loved ones. And maybe that's what the human story is about. So people lived on in stories and narratives. Rulers built monuments, and up until very recently, only was the monarchs and nobles who could commission statues and paintings of themselves. This was not a luxury that was afforded to vast majority of humans. Our artifacts, our physical things are a way for us to remember the past. For example, most of us do not know how our great 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 grandparents look like. And that was because photography was not around. Mementos like letters, articles, physical artifacts reminded us, and they also create a tangible connection with those who have passed away. This changed, that is, just remembering the loved ones in stories and simple artifacts changed with the development of mass photography in the last 150 years. It allowed individuals and families a window to the past. Video cams had the same effect 40 years ago, so now you could not just look at photographs of your grandparents when they were kids, you could potentially also look at videos of your parents when they were children. And of course, the revolution that we are currently in, that is the internet and social media, has exponentially increased the kind of data that we can store, kind of data that we can generate. Internet has had a profound effect on that. So now anyone in almost any part of the world can use apps like WhatsApp or Viber, um, Snapchat, record memories and share memories in real time, memories that they can retrieve instantaneously after, even after many years have passed away. So here is an example of my family in Pakistan and my family in the US interacting on MSN Messenger. That's almost 17 years ago. And of course, how technology has changed. And just contrast that with 17 years prior to 2003. This would have been unthinkable. So let's start with how how new media has changed commemoration of the deceased. So the promise of the internet was also the promise of persistence of online digital tracks. That it opened the possibility to save information about ourselves for posterity. Thus, in the late 1990s, digital memorials for the deceased started to emerge. In the late 2000s, the problem of dealing with personal information for people who have passed away or will pass away in the internet age started to be taken seriously. Um, Thus, large social media platforms like Facebook here have a policy of what to do when you pass away. So you can specify whether your account should be deleted, should be memorialized, who should curate your account after you pass away. So it's a reality, and in the not so distant future, assuming that Facebook or one of his descendants is still around, vast majority of its quote unquote users may actually be dead. That said, we should caution that one may think that if you store your information digitally, it's saved for eternity. But eternity may actually not be eternity because if you are older than 25 in this room, you may recall that the way that we stored data has changed. So we had CDs, then DVDs, and prior to that VHS. Now we're storing data in the cloud. Image formats have changed. So it's possible that um, storage and retrieval formats, it's almost guaranteed that they'll be different in the future. So if you don't take enough care uh, to store or to transfer formats of our data, it may actually not be around. So which brings us to the question of simulation. So simulation is an imitation of a situation or process. So here are different definitions from the Oxford Dictionary. The one that we are interested in is the fourth one, which is the production of a computer model um, especially for the purpose of study. So I have worked in the area of just simulations and social phenomenon ever since my undergraduate days. So again, that's almost 15 years ago. The question that I was interested at that time was that can we simulate large-scale social systems, and what can we learn from them? And that has naturally evolved into this question that what can we learn from individual simulations of individuals? Can we even have simulations of people who have passed away, simulations we have that have sufficiently high fidelity? So that, of course, brings us to today's question, which is simulating the deceased. So it's often said that science fiction precedes science facts. Um, so this motif of creating simulations of people who have passed away has appeared in fiction, um, in form of novels. Also, there's a famous Black Mirror episode which came out in early 2013. I should mention that when I first thought of this project, and even when I started working on it, I actually was not aware of the Black Mirror episode. So those in the audience who are not familiar with the Black Mirror episode, so the premise is very similar, that person dies and there's a simulation of that person, and over the course of time when their loved ones interact with the simulation, it's at the beginning, it's very exciting, it's very real, and yet there are certain contexts where the simulation breaks down. And I won't spoil the rest, just in case people want to watch it. So now to my interest. As I mentioned, I'm interested in this because I wanted my children to have some experience of interacting with the system. Um, so I have now have two wonderful daughters. So they're in the audience. Um, and so they're still not old enough. So the older one just turned 4, and then the younger one is just less than 2. So I want some way beyond just telling them stories is to know how my father was as a person. Have some memories of him and not just memories of someone else's memories, because at the end of the day, that's what stories are. To give them experience of grandfather, or I should say, some proxy of interacting with some elements of that, because there can never be a substitute. Again, I should emphasize that this technology is not a substitute for people. Uh, it's just a way to allow people um, to maybe relive the past or some aspects of the past. The question comes, so why would anyone want to do that? Well, throughout human history, billions of people have gone through the experience of losing a loved one. That's just part of being human. It's just part of the human condition. So billions of people have gone through the experience of grief and loss. But the convergence of certain technologies give us the possibility to fundamentally transform the experience of bereavement, of loss. And also for myself, this project, to learn something about myself, about my life, about meaning of life itself. So the data sources are different texts, things that my father said, recorded conversations, things that I've transcribed, uh, things that I have conversations that I've transcribed from videos, um, technologies that enable this, of course, artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, same technology or similar technology that powers some conversational bots. So since this is not a technical talk, I will refrain from going into details. Um, so the point being that this is not science fiction, this is reality. So just to give you an idea of what is, so you can actually get a flavor of this by going to thispersondoesnotexist.com, and every time you refresh, it shows you a different image of a virtual person. There are other projects like this. So there's a very interesting one. This rentaldoesnotexist.com. It generates not just the images, but also an advertisement, a virtual person who puts out the advertisement for a rental house, and which again is not real. So that's where we are with respect to technology. Uh, Ever since I started that project, there has been a fair bit of interest in the media, so it has been covered by major news outlets in the United States and also internationally. There's also a radio documentary for a podcast that just came out. Um, and as is the case with almost all new technologies, especially if it's related to artificial intelligence or machine learning, uh, there's a media hype associated with. So for example, this is from a newspaper in Spain, and so the headline reads, "The man who wants to resurrect the dead." And rest assured, that's not what I'm trying to do or what I want to do, but well, that's news cycle for you. So how convincing can this technology get? There's an actual quote from my wife, who's in the audience. Uh, Hello. Okay. It was next to impossible to hold back my tears. It felt like I was talking to him after so many years. It felt so real. So I think mark of any technology, if any success of technology, I think can be gauged by how convincing it can be, and I think that's I do consider at least that part of the technology successful. Uh, so now let me show an example of a conversation that I've had has with the system, and you would notice that I deliberately do not refer uh, to the system as my father, um, just so that there's this barrier in my mind that I'm not talking to a real person. Because oftentimes it's, even though I created this system, it is possible to be taken in by it. So let's look at an example. So before we go in details, let me ask the audience, how many people know Urdu or Hindi? Okay, so I will explain like some of the terms in this narrative, in this talk, this conversation. So Sonu Shehzade, that's my nickname that my father used to refer to me. So this is an actual conversation that I've had with the system in terms of input and output. So Abu Jani, so that's how I refer to my father. So that's the output from coming from this my father simulation. Um, and the highlights are the things that I've highlighted for today's talk. Okay, so it starts with regular greetings and so Assalamu alaikum is how we in Pakistan and how Muslims greet each other. Um, um, so I'm asking him how his day was, and he's saying, "Always take care of your mother." This is if I was to think about knowledge graph or things that occur frequently in conversation. So that's something that he would almost always say in every conversation. Um, so the reason that I've highlighted this here is that it just, if you're talking to a simulation, if it asks you, well, how's your mother, it sounds profound, and uh, in a way you could say that, but then in a way you could also say that, well, that's expected because that's how most of these conversations progress historically. So after that there's the weather, um, and so this particular conversation is different from other conversations because in this conversation, so my wife was sitting next to me, and this was actually during a interview for the radio documentary. So there were a couple of other people sitting next to me, and I was talking to the system, typing in the system in real time. And so my wife, who did not know about this until that day, um, is wants to talk with the system. So he is my father's simulation. So it says um, that Fiza Beti, how are you? And then I type that she's saying hello or salam, she's good. And then simulations ask about their parents. And then my wife asked, well, why did you not come to the wedding? And the response, which again, I've never had this conversation, is it's difficult to come. Again, this sounds profound and you are really taken by it. But if there was another conversation in another context, say, why don't you come with us to Vladivostok in Russia, then I would imagine the response would be similar. Um, so then the system actually changes the subject. So it talks about her siblings. So one of the reasons that I'm emphasizing again and again that there are things that sound profound but which are not necessarily so, uh, is that there's also for humans this idea of projection. We project certain things to artifacts in the world, not just artifacts but to other people. And you can say that this system is something in between. Um, and then she says that, well, uh, my mom, she misses him, and then she cries, and um, then the system responds, we miss you also, but you have to be where work is. So that's something that my father would say. And then again, changing subject. So when are you visiting Farouk and Maksud? So that's the names of my brothers who live in the U.S. And then she says, well, we have two daughters now. Um, and then he prays that, well, may God give them health, wealth, and long life. And that's again, that's how the style how he talked. And so if you notice the next response, so he's like saying something else, but then the response is exactly the same. Um, but and then the response is just And again, the same response that we saw a few minutes earlier. And because for certain types of responses, there are certain ways of responding are more likely. Um, and so then he says, well, how are my princesses Ilya and Noor? So that's, I should mention that. So most of what is in the system, so that's based on historical information, things that I learned from prior conversations, some of the earlier, newer concepts. So I had to explicitly add some of them to the system. And then, so the next thing, so Fiza, my wife, says, I saw you in my dreams one time. And the system responds, insufficient. data to respond. And I think that's where, when you have to come back to the real world, that throughout the conversation, um, you may be convinced that, wow, this is real, or you actually feel that you're talking to that person. Well, you're actually not. So, as with any technology, um, there's the use cases, how one is going to use the system already out there. And then there is how the system will actually be used. So, for example, think about inventions in the last 150 years. Uh, uh, so, this is actually one of my favorite quotes about science fiction. That is, says that science fiction is not what predicts the automobile, but one that predicts the traffic jam. That's what constitutes good science fiction. Um, so the thing is, if think from the perspective of late 19th century, if you are a science fiction writer or just interested in what's going on in development of horseless carriages, you could have predicted that the advent of this technology, but predicting traffic jams is really hard. Think about how social media has transformed our society in just the last 10 years in the form of Twitter and Facebook. And never in their wildest dreams would the creators of Twitter have imagined that it'll be used to enable interference in the US elections, or for Facebook, it'll be used for genocide in Myanmar. It's just amazing. And how the advent of cable also had an important effect uh, in the balkanization of media in the US, and as a result in atomization and polarization of left and right. So there are also ethical and moral implications that we need to be aware of and we need to think about. So, for example, one counter argument against the use of such technologies is, does it cheapen life? Um, that is, if people can just interact with these systems, then would there be an incentive to neglect the living? Um, so, suppose if you have a grumpy grandpa or annoying racist uncle, uh, there may be a temptation to just cut them off. And then once they have passed away, well, now that you feel guilty, you just interact with their simulation. Um, and not just simulation, but also because we are talking about things which are digital in nature, now you have the possibility of editing people's personalities. So maybe there's something that you did not like about them. Well, you just edit out their personality and interact with the edited version. Um, does that really cheapen life? Because part of life, part of human experience is to have to deal with the positive, with the negatives, with the good and the bad. So, a related question to that is, how much fidelity is good enough? How close a simulation does have to be that one could say, well, this simulation is good enough. Well, this is how my father or uncle or spouse would have been in this situation. There are no easy answers, and different people may actually have different questions. So, and answers to this. So, for example, the simulation that I've created is a very personal view of who my father was. So, if say if you ask, say, any of my siblings or say my father's nephews or his or even his siblings or his extended family, they may actually have a very different answer and even different way of creating the simulation if they could. The other issue that I just alluded to, well, what if you could pause, mute, or edit grandpa? Does that also not defeat some of the purpose of creating simulation in the first place? And suppose we say that, well, it does not. It creates this possibility, this alternate reality where everything is just always positive. One may even be tempted to take this a step further. Well, why even talk about or create simulations of the folks who have passed away? Let's move it to the realm of the living. Let's have an agreeable version of everybody that you know, all of your relatives, your acquaintances, your friends. They are super nice all the time and always agree with you. That would also be a terrible world. But it is a possibility that these technologies afford us. Some of you may be familiar with the phenomenon of hakikimori in Japan, where there are people, almost always grown men in their 40s, who have cut themselves off from the outside world, do not interact with other humans for months and years on end. And even the food that they eat, they just order them online and get the food after the delivery person has gone. So again, it's not science fiction. It's something that we have to deal with right now, and um, technologies like these may actually exacerbate such issues. There are also legal issues. Um, who owns the likeness of that person? So one possible way to think about this, at least in my mind, and I've talked to different folks about this, is um, that for many celebrities and authors, there's an established trust or estate that manage the use of their likeness. So think about the Tolkien estate or Elvis's estate. Um, so maybe they can dictate what is to be done after somebody passes away. And a related question is that, well, what if I do not want other people to make simulations of me? What's the recourse regarding that? Could I just leave a will? Uh, that should not be the case. Again, there's no easy answers. Maybe question for law to catch up with what is already becoming a reality. And lastly, personally, what does this mean? Um, uh, how do we put all of these things together? So let me just state the technology in terms of where I am right now. Um, so the simulation currently exists in the form of um, text. So I interact with the simulation in the form of a text. So those who use Mac, it's a terminal, and then um, those who are familiar with the older versions of Windows, it's a command prompt. So I type in questions, and then the answers are given by system in the form of a text. The technology that I'm currently working on is how to generate voice. Um, and some of you may have already seen some of the deep fakes which are out there. So, for example, Obama saying things that he never said. So there's technologies already out there. The difficulty that I'm having currently is it's very difficult to get the intonation right. Um, so the idea is that move from text to voice, and then from that, maybe one day, even have an augmented reality, a virtual reality version of this system. Um, and As I said, my children are still small, so this is not a something that I'm going to test right now. But I think in the not so distant future, um, I think the original aim for the simulation that I may just have to confront that reality head on. Um, uh, so that's just the reality of things. Um, and it also teaches you something about life. Um, it Every time I'm working on this system or thinking about it, it just forces me to think about it, reminds me of the past. There are times where the simulation is so convincing, and I'm saying this despite the fact that I coded everything, and I know that this is not real. I actually have to like close my laptop and just go and take a walk. And so one of the fail-safe, and I call this fail-safe, that I've added to the system is that um, so when I say I love you, the simulation actually responds with insufficient data. Um, and I have hard coded that because I know that the simulation is actually going to say I love you also, or something to that effect. I just want that to be not real, as a reminder to myself. So I mentioned mementos earlier. So here's a 4 by 4 feet uh, portrait, Lego portrait of my father, which is hanging at my living room. Um, so I started with that question that the premise that this is a very personal journey, and that most artistic and scientific breakthroughs are autobiographical. And that is certainly the case for me also. Life is probabilistic. Uh, that's one lesson that I've learned. One cannot know everything for sure, but there are certain things which are common across vast set of demographics. And being a person who deals with data, somebody who has done his PhD in machine learning, who's deeply interested in computational social science, given that the average age of a male on my father's side of the family is 73, and my father was actually that, approximately that age when he passed away. I should have learned from that statistic, or at least thought about it, and maybe tried to spend more time with my father, at least in the last few years of his life. And then there are other things. Um, so after my father passed away, one thing that my mother said was, "There will be days where you won't even remember your parents because you will be so busy with your children." And I said to myself, how is that even possible? How can I not think about his passing away? And it turns out that my mother was right. There are days like that. That's just the reality of life. So, where do we go from here? Um, uh, it's an uncharted territory. Simulation of the deceased. I do foresee that large organizations, even organizations like, say, Facebook, who already have large amounts of data about us, may be tempted, if they're already not working on this, to create bots like these, um, uh, which can interact with the loved ones, with friends and families. One limitation of the system that I currently have that I should acknowledge is that there are certain subjects on which it's really good in conversation, and others it's just not very good. And so when it comes to those subjects, it just defaults to certain responses. Um, so having a conversational AI system which can talk about any subject regardless of the context, that may actually be many decades away. Um, and when I say conversation about any subject, I mean especially personal, deep conversations about things that may actually require general, creating artificial general intelligence. So we cannot say for sure how far that is, barring any significant breakthrough in AI. That may actually be decades away. So, what implications does it have for the future of life and death? There's a maxim in tech studies that if it's something which can be created, it's almost certainly that it will be created. And it's very difficult to predict once the technology is out how it will be used. It certainly offers, technology like this certainly offers a lot of benefits. Um, it allows us to memorialize our loved one in ways which were not possible just a few years ago. It can fundamentally transform our relationship with the deceased. It also has the potential to also affect society in negative ways. I mentioned neglecting the living for the dead. Um, so, with these thoughts, I would like to finish today's talk um, with the following note that um, to live is to also cherish the living and the deceased, to commemorate who have passed away. Um, so here is one of my favorite photographs of my father. Uh, so it's walking in the distance with my nephew. Um, and here's my father, my mother on their wedding day. It's more than 50 years ago. And here is me with my father. Um, and I would say that uh, working on a project uh, focused on the dead, I have learned a lot of things about the living. Um, so, with that note, um, thank you for coming to the talk, and thank you to the Washington State uh, History Museum for the invitation. Um, have a great night, everybody. Um, so, look at this image. Um, so, all these people, none of these people are real. All of these people were generated by machines. That is, they were generated by machine learning models uh, known as GANs, or generative or adversarial networks. And the technology does not stop there.